Hello, and welcome to Into the Abyss, the semi-regular video blog about the Abyssal realms, including the games Deep Wars and Shadowsea. In this second episode, we're going to cover how to play the game and kind of a primer on what the game is and how to play it. So for those of you maybe a little bit new, Deep Wars and Shadowsea are games from Antimatter Games. They are sister rule sets where one is the underwater deep sea action skirmish level game and one is on land. Shadowsea is the land-based version. And in this episode, we're going to focus on a primer, like I mentioned earlier, of how to play the game. This episode is not an in-depth analysis of the game, but really just trying to level set the new player or the novice player or the experienced wargamer who's interested in picking up Deep Wars on how to play the game and really just the basics. We're not going to get into super details here. Mostly we're going to talk about terminology and what the stats are and what you can do and how a turn might work and some other basic mechanics of the game. So that you can go look at some of the other videos that I put out, either the Tactica videos or the battle reports or what have you. So you'll have some kind of common frame of reference and you'll know a little bit what we're talking about. So let's talk a little bit about what Deep Wars is. Deep Wars is a tabletop war game where forces battle below the waves of a lost underground ocean beneath the frozen southern continent on Earth, vying for control over ancient sunken ruins and wrecks holding powerful artifacts and golden treasure. Players command warbands, so each player has a warband of n number of models. Warbands are usually between 4 to 8 models. And they, from 1 to 4 main forces, and there's a 5th force that was released with the supplemental book called Blood Reef. And you put your warriors to the test, and they can gain experience, and they can go through combat and explore and recover a little treasure and gain experience. And you can use it as a campaign style system, or you can use it as a one-off tactical wargaming system as well. Deep Wars is a continuation of the adventures from Shadowsea game. Again, Deep Wars being undersea specific rules and Shadowsea being on land rules, taking place in the same time period and immersed in many of the same forces, but introduces new rules for combat and beneath the sea or above the sea, for flying in Shadowsea and kind of swimming for Deep Wars, and battles aboard breached submersibles and magic and other ether technology is kind of captured in both the rule sets. So the Deep Wars and Shadowsea rule set is based on the Song of Blades and Heroes rule set, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's heavily based on that, but it's its own rule system. So if you're familiar with those, or if you're familiar with the Song of Blades and Heroes, you'll probably be fairly familiar with Deep Wars. The setting of the game is in the late 17th century, which is many years after initial discovery of an underground world of the Shadowsea. Now, the Shadowsea is kind of this area that is kind of the environs of the game. The combination of the Shadowsea and Deep Wars environs is just kind of generally or collectively referred to as the Abyssal realm. So you'll hear some of those words or those terms used interchangeably. So there's this underground world of the Shadowsea, and it's a realm located miles beneath the lands of a perpetual ice and snow basically under Antarctica, the southernmost continent of Earth. The subsequent recovery of ancient technology that explorers found there, first by the Fortune Hunters, which is one of the factions that we'll be talking about in time, has fueled the development of advanced undersea vehicles and personal dive suits and other tech that allow adventurers to explore previously inaccessible areas of the deep. And other forces have been drawn to these ruins to gain some of this artifacts and this technology as well. All of these are which are entirely adapted to underwater environments. This tech is entirely adapted to underwater environments. And there's multiple forces vying for control of these artifacts and these ether crystals, which kind of imbue these artifacts with their power. So in this episode, we're going to cover the very basics of the rule set. We won't go into any level of depth here, pun intended, but in general, we'll go do an overview of the basics of the rules. Watching this should give you some kind of basic insight as to, if you watched one of the battle reports, you'll have a little bit more understanding of how the turn works, how the modifiers work, how movement and combat works, and whatnot. So hopefully the terminology will start to become familiar to you if you watch this episode and then you kind of apply that learning to watching the battle reports. Let's first start by talking about the basics of the setup of the game. So typically, players first agree on the size of the battle they want to play in the form of points. So this should be familiar to most wargamers, but if you're not familiar with that, there's a points-based system where you use a certain budget of points to buy models that are in your warband. A 400-point game gives each player 400 points worth of models to play with, and so each model has a certain amount of points associated with it, and you build your warband and you don't exceed that 400 point limit. So a 400 point game is a relatively small game, or a smaller battle, but probably on the low side of a reasonable sized game. And a larger battle is going to be like something like 800 points, which would give you 800 points worth of models to play with in your warband, and so on. And once the points of the size of the battle is chosen or agreed to, the players then kind of think about, okay, what faction am I going to play? What's the composition of my force? And so you basically start figuring out what's your warband composition going to look like. So typically a player will pick one faction and then selects models from that faction. There are also mercenaries that the player can select models from in the form of a faction called the Scaly Horde. They're a standalone faction, as well as they can be used as mercenaries to add to another faction for your warband. But we won't get quite into that level of detail here. But long story short, you pick a faction. You've picked the point size or the size of the battle that you want to do, and then you build your force from there. So for the purposes of simplicity, let's say each player picks models from one faction, and they're going to build a 800-point force. You pick a faction that you want to play. There are 5 playable factions in Deep Wars, and there's more in Shadowsea, and there is some overlap between Shadowsea and Deep Wars, but we'll focus on Deep Wars for this. There are 5 playable factions in Deep Wars and several additional factions to play in Shadowsea. We'll go over to faction details in subsequent videos in much more gory detail, but to summarize, the factions are as follows. There's the Fortune Hunters, which are human explorers, scientists, archaeologists, treasure seekers, scoundrels, and pirates who have happened upon this ancient underground and undersea world, and they're basically the humans of the world. There's also a faction called the Ancients of Adelon. They're a mysterious and enigmatic race of ancients whose true motivations are as mysterious as they are. So they're very mysterious, and they're kind of kind of the more lighter build, but they're kind of thought of as maybe fast or more agile or more precise in their attacks and whatnot. Another one of the factions is called the Dark Mariners, and they are a twisted race of aberrant beings that are bent on domination and power and taking back their rightful place in the world. And they are kind of this mix of Cthulhu beast monsters and tentacled, calcareous bone formation armor, and kind of a cross between tentacled Cthulhu horrors and mutant spawn. There's also a faction called the Scaly Horde, which is a loose confederation of dragon men, fish men creatures, aliens, and giant predatory war beasts like giant sharks or giant fish, or ancient fish like an armored bony-headed fish, or some sort of large prehistoric swimming direfish lizard type of thing. So it's just kind of this conglomeration of all these, varied types of sea creatures that are in this loose confederation. They're all they're seeking treasure and glory, and also kind of protect the deep from interlopers. And one of the newer factions is called the Nereids, which is a race of mermaids and mermen. And they've also got some dangerous sea creatures like sharks and poisonous sea serpents and other things. And they also have some goblins that come to their aid and other war beasts. But basically, the Nereids are a race of fast moving, and they hit fast, and they move. They hit hard and they move fast, and they're basically the mer creature, the merfolk of the world. All of these races are really vying for glory or treasure or power or conquest or whatever you set your scenario up for. Sometimes it's just mere survival. Sometimes you're trying to defeat the other crew. Sometimes you're trying to capture all the treasures or capture all the objectives. All sorts of natures of games can be played. So you select your faction. You've selected points that you want to play, and you pick models from that warband, like I said, to fill up the points of your warband. And once you've got that all set, you're basically ready to play a game. You obviously need to set up a table with some terrain and maybe some objectives and whatnot, and so on, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So like I said, each model in the warband costs a certain number of points, and we're going to talk about Each one of these models has a card that's associated with them that tells you all of the rules. And so one thing that when you're putting together your warband, you need to pay attention to personality models versus regular trooper models. There's really only two types of characters or models that you can place in your warband. That's a little bit of a simplification, but in general, only half of your points in your warband can be personalities. Personalities are usually things like named characters or unique characters unique to the world, or they're certain hero types, or they're particularly powerful types, or I guess I would say unique types of models that you can put in your warband, and you can really only have up to 50% of your points cost in personalities. There are oftentimes you can only have, if you've got one, like the Beast of Blood Reef is a named war beast in the Nereids faction. You can only have one of those. You can only have one of those in your warband. Now, if you're playing Nereids versus Nereids, could you have one side have a Beast of Blood Reef and another side have a Beast of Blood Reef? Sure. It's particular to the warband, not to the overall game. So there are unique models as well. But you put together your warband. You've got your personality models, and then you've got your trooper models, and so you can have up to the points limit. But you can go 10 points over. So sometimes the points don't add up, perfectly to the number that you're trying to target for the whole warband. So there's a little bit of allowance in the rules to say, okay, look, for whatever warband point size that you're putting together, you can go 10 points over. That's totally legit, because sometimes the points don't always hit 800 on the nose or 400 on the nose or whatever you're looking for. You can also put war gear on your models. There's rules for that. Sometimes, you need help with targeting, or you need help with lights in the Abyssal realm so you can see, your models can see. There's all sorts of different war gear that you can give your models, and we won't go into too much detail there, but suffice it to say there's a long list of war gear that you can give your models. I tend not to do it because models tend to come with pretty good war gear, and adding more war gear adds more points to your model. You have to pay for these in terms of points, and the models usually are pretty good as is, but sometimes you want to give them a little bit of extra oomph. The one thing you need to pay attention to is that your models tend to be able to use a certain CL or complexity level, and they can't use items that have a higher complexity level than they're able to use. Like, so if, for example, a model has the ability to use complexity level 1 items, which are pretty basic items, they can't use complexity level 2 items because it's kind of beyond their understanding to use. So you can give models additional war gear. The models usually come by default on their playing cards with war gear, but you can go into the rule book and give your models additional war gear if you want. So you can go 10 points over. We talked a little bit about war gear. Another thing about list building that you might want to pay attention to is that there are certain magical types of models that can be used as summoners. They can summon war beasts, or they can summon other types of models. And you can put a certain number of points in your warband that aren't for models, but are used later on as a buffer to put points of models to summon into your warband. So like maybe you've got an 800 point list, you set aside 75 points for summoning. Later on in the game, you can summon 150 points worth of creatures with that list. So we'll talk about that probably in a future episode here, but just know that you can put points towards a summoning pool, which is not your actual models in your warband, but allows you to pull in additional and more points worth of models later on in the scenario or as gameplay evolves. So once you've done that, so you've picked a faction, you've picked the points level, you've made your warband, so there's some rules governing that. Once you've done all that, you're ready to pick your scenario, and then you're able to play your game. So now that you've selected your warband and you've got an opponent with an opposing warband, you're ready to pick your game. So the simplest type of game is the basic battle scenario, where one game is played and the winner is determined by the victory conditions that give points for defeating enemies or accomplishing objectives. And so there's various different battle scenarios or one-off game type of scenarios, or even as part of a campaign, you can you string these things together with some narrative. But there's multiple different missions or scenarios in the book that you can play. So like one of the first common ones to play would be Conquer, which is basically a King of the Hill type of scenario where you need to have personality models in the center of the table, and you rack up victory points every turn by the number of personalities that you have near the center of the table, or the number of enemies you kill near the center of the table. So that's one example of a mission where you play towards these objectives, and they're clearly lined out in each scenario in the book. So each scenario or mission will, there's different missions like slaying the opposing force or capture objectives or, make off with the treasures or survive to the end of the game, so on and so forth. So these are all kind of outlined in the book. Each scenario that may imply that you need certain skill sets in your warband in order to achieve the objectives. And so this is kind of important. So sometimes you want to build your warband or think about your warband construction based on the scenario you're playing. So for example, in one scenario, the warbands must try to achieve an objective of basically activating an ancient device on the seafloor, which requires a scientist or someone who has ether tech skill in order to activate it. So therefore, you're going to want to have that skill set in your warband to maximize your chances of, achieving that objective. So, having a scientist in your warband who actually has that skill set will really be beneficial to you. So sometimes you might want to think about the scenario you're playing and agree with your opponent, like, hey, if we're going to play this type of scenario, we need to make sure that we've got these skill sets in our warband. Or, hey, you just basically build what's an all-comers list and say, hey, I'm not going to tool out my warband for pure combat. Maybe I tool them out for, being able to breach walls or activate devices with a scientist or, things of this nature. And so maybe it's not optimized for one type of scenario, but that lets you roll into any scenario and have a reasonable chance of success. So things to kind of think about in terms of when you're building your warband. Do you need to kind of think about what scenario you're playing? Do you want to kind of go into a generic, have that conversation with your opponent, see what they want to do, advocate for what you want to do. And so sometimes a lot of fun can be had on either end of that spectrum of kind of deciding how to mix the two of your warband creation and the scenario that you want to play. So now that once you've selected your warband, you've selected your scenario, now you've got your table all set up and it's full of beautiful terrain. There's rules governing, the placement of terrain as well. It's all there in the rule book. We won't dedicate a lot of time here, but there are rules for terrain. Sometimes you can use them, sometimes you don't have to. I think it's completely optional whether or not you want to use specific rules around terrain. Probably in your first few games, you just want to set up terrain that's like line of sight blocking. Don't worry too much about the special rules of the terrain. Just kind of get yourself familiar with how the activations work, how the stats work, and how your the turn flow goes. But definitely take a look at some of the terrain special rules. There adds a lot of flavor and a lot of a lot of flavor and substance to the games that normally wouldn't be there. It's just instead of just kind of going after each other and trying to kill the other warband. So definitely take a look at that. But we won't, like I said, we won't go into that too much in detail here, but know that those things are there. Okay, so forces selected, table set up, you're ready to game. So how does the game actually work? Let's get into the meat of this video blog. How does the game actually work? And we're going to start by helping you understand, what do the stats on the cards mean? So each model, like I said, when you put them together in your warband, they have a certain points number and there's stats associated with each model. So I think the first thing we do is let's make sure we understand what those stats on those cards mean. So let's give an example here. We'll go over that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the basics of the mechanics of a turn. How does it work, the flow of it, and how you use those stats to manipulate your models in the game. So first, let's take a look at this particular card here. This is a great example card. This is a really good baseline leader model for the Fortune Hunters. His name is Ironbelly Clegg. He's a Sea Dog captain. And so you're looking at the front and the back side, left and right respectively, of a game card for a model for Deep Wars. So all models come with cards just like this. The details and the data on the cards are different, but every model in the game has a card like this. So let's break it down a little bit. So for the Fortune Hunters, like I said, there's this guy named Ironbelly Clegg. He's a Sea Dog captain. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's that 85. That's how many points the model is. So he is 85 points. So let's say you're making that 400 point warband. That's for a smallish size game. He's 85 points of that 400 points. So he's got a name. He gets a little bit of, just to the right of the points there, that 85 points is his name and kind of who he is. Right below that, there you'll see this underlined thing, personality model. That was what we were talking about earlier, that he's a personality model. So you can only have up to half your warband in personality models. So that's kind of important. Regular troopers won't have anything there. So personalities, you will know a personality model by this little tag here right under the name. name, whether or not it's denoting a personality model. So then you've got a picture of the model. The cards are great because actually some of the older cards have like art, which is wonderful. And I love the art, but the newer cards, I think in general, actually, I don't know if that's true or not, but I like the cards that have the picture of the model on them. So you can go directly to the model line on the Antimatter Games website, or look at someone's collection and say, that's exactly the model that this thing is. So you can have a direct connection to the name of the model and what it is and what the model actually is that represents it. So it kind of gives you a little bit of information about the identity. There's these little yellow and orange circles kind of going down the left side column here. And so you see that Q3 plus, the C3, the 5 plus, the 5 plus, and the 3 plus. Like, what the heck does all that mean? Okay, so that's actually pretty simple. There are two main stats in Deep Wars and Shadow Sea. And really, frankly, in the game systems, they're identical game systems in terms of stats and what they mean and whatnot. So Q is quality and C is combat. Quality is sort of a measure of the overall effectiveness of your model. So a quality 3 model means that you can activate more frequently than, say, a quality 4 model. I'll get into the mechanics of what that means. But really, when you see a Q3, think of the 3, the lower that number, the better. So a Q2 model, that's fantastic. A Q4 model, not so good. I don't know if there's any Q5 models. I don't know if there's any quality 5 models. If there are, I haven't encountered them. But Q3, that's good. Q2, that's amazing. Q4, that's kind of standard trooper, regular person. And so let's break down what that quality means. So in Deep Wars and in Shadow Sea, there is a mechanic called activating your model. And so the turns alternate between my turn and your turn. So on my turn, I go through activating all of my models. And once I'm done activating all my models, it goes over to the other player's turn. What this quality means is you have to activate all the models in your warband, and then you turn it over. There's more details to that, but suffice to say, I go through and activate all mine, then you go through and activate all of yours. I can activate any one of my models with what's called a quick activation, meaning I can take one action and then move on to the next model in my warband. And I get that for free. There's no luck or risk or chance involved. Like if I had Iron Belly Clegg in my warband and I wanted him to move, let's say do one movement and then go to my next model to activate, I would do that one movement and then his activation would be over. Now, there is an interesting mechanic in Deep Wars where you can actually get more mileage out of your models. If you want to get more than one action a turn, you do what's called an activation roll or a quality check or an activation check. You try to get more actions with your model. So this is how you really get the most power out of your models, is that you can roll the dice, so to speak, and you can roll the dice and see if you can get more action out of each model. So how does that work? Every model can roll 2 or 3 dice when they activate. And so let's say you pick 3 dice. The more 3 pluses I get, the more actions I get. So let's say I roll, it's my turn, I'm going to activate Iron Belly Clegg, and I want to try to get multiple actions out of him. So you'll hear on the battle reports, or you'll hear your opponent, or you'll hear yourself say, okay, I'm attempting multiple activations, activating on 3s. So I roll the dice. For every 3 plus, I get 1 action. So if I roll a 3, 4, and a 5, that means I get 3 actions. If I roll a 3, a 1, and a 4, that means I get 2 actions because I got a 3 and a 4. Both are 3 or higher, but that 1, that doesn't count as an action. So I'm rolling the dice to see if I can get more actions than just the 1 with that quick activation. Now there's a flip side to this. With every risk, there's a reward, and with every risk, there's a potential downside. So when I roll those 3 dice, if I get more failures than successes, I automatically turn over the turn to my opponent. So that's kind of a little bit of a big deal. So like on the Iron Belly Clegg, let's say I roll 3 dice and I roll a 1, a 2, and a 3. Well, I got 1 3 plus, but I got a 1 and a 2, which are definitely not 3 or higher. So that means I still get credit for the 1-3 that I rolled. So I get to take my 1 action, but then I have to turn over the turn. Like if I've got other models that have not activated that turn, they don't get to activate. Right? So it's a little bit of a risk versus a reward thing here. It's like, okay, I can go for broke. I can try to roll legendary and get all 3s or whatever the number, my target quality number is. But if I get less than that, I run the risk of not having the opportunity to activate some of my other models. Now, sometimes you actually want to do that, and that's a little bit of a more of a higher level strategy type thing, and we can talk about that at some other future video. But suffice it to say, your quality is really a measure of how effective your model is on the tabletop. So quality is also used for things like determining whether or not you if you try to disengage from combat, if you're in base to base with another model, you don't want to fight that model, you try and disengage, you can roll a quality check. And if you get 2 or more successes, you can step away from that model and it does not get what's called a free hack on you. So suffice it to say, there's other types of quality checks, and activation is a type of quality check, which just happens to be you're starting your activation. Hey, I want to do more than that one free action. I'm going to try to roll legendary, or I'm going to try to roll better than my quality. So another thing that you'll notice is that, at least if you watch the battle reports, sometimes if, we'll say, hey, my model is quality 4 or my model is quality 3, I'm within a long stick of my leader. Leader gives you a bonus. We're going to skip down here for real quick because it's really applicable here. You look under that special abilities, you see that column of circles on the left, then that small box or that box in the middle of the card on the front side of the card says special abilities. It's got leader. What that means is that if you have another model within a long stick of this particular guy, you get a bonus to your activation checks at the beginning of your activation. So leader does not stack on leader. Like you can't have a leader next to a leader to give the leader that you're trying to activate a quality buff. But this particular guy will give quality buffs to the models around him to help them activate better. So that gives you +1 on your activation roll. So let's say you have a regular trooper who's quality 4 standing right next to Iron Belly Clegg. If you activate that regular trooper who's quality 4 next to the Iron Belly Clegg, you get +1 on your activation. So you're effectively activating that guy at quality 3. There's a big difference between trying to do multiple actions between a quality 3 and a quality 4 model. So suffice it to say, quality is really a measure of your reactiveness or your effectiveness, your overall effectiveness at doing actions on the battlefield. The next stat is called combat. So combat 3 is, 3 is a number, and we'll talk a little bit about how effective that is. Your combat stat I've seen as low as 2. I've seen up to 5. I don't know that I've seen a 6. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the flip is true on combat. If your number is higher, it is better. So the way that combat works is there's lots of modifiers that happen, but let's say you get into base to base with another model and you want to use one of your actions to attack it. You'd spend the action to attack. Your base number on your combat is whatever this number is. So for Iron Belly Clegg, it's 3. Your weapons might have modifiers. Let's say it's a +1 weapon or something. You might have some other modifiers. And so your opponent also has a combat score. So basically it's an opposed dice roll. You add up your combat score plus any other modifiers. You roll the dice. You add all the modifiers up. And the delta between your number and your opponent's number is called the winning combat difference, or WCD. Basically, you are trying to add up all of your modifiers and roll a D6, 1d6, and have that number bigger than what your opponent rolls. If it's bigger, chances are good that you might have done some damage. But basically, the key takeaway here is that quality, a lower number is better, and with combat, a higher number is better. Let's talk about the secondary stats that are below that: strength, resistance, and willpower. So things like strength is like, hey, if you're trying to fight against the current, or if you're trying to break a tentacle hold from a Dark Mariner, or you're trying to do some feat of strength to resist something or lift something or open something, there's often effects or rules that require you to do a strength check. Basically, it's just like a quality check, where you see this guy with Iron Belly Clegg, he's got strength of 5 up. In order to have a successful strength check, Iron Belly Clegg needs to roll 3 dice, and he needs to get at least 2 5s in order to succeed that strength check. That's all that number means. So that 5 plus the strength. Resistance, like if you're in an acoustic zone, and you might take damage based on a spell that you go into a zone or something. It's like it'll say make a resistance roll, just like with quality, just like with strength. A resistance roll is you roll 3d6. Every 5 plus you roll will give you a success, and usually, most of the time, but you have to read the rules because every situation is different, but usually you're looking for at least 2 successes to avoid the bad thing or to succeed in the good effect that you're looking for on any one of these types of rolls. So you'll also see this little note next to it says AV bonus +1 resistance roll. So sometimes resistance rolls allows you to use your armor value to improve it. Like if you're wearing armor, it might be easier for you to resist poisonous algae or who knows what. It really kind of depends on what you're trying to do. But also note that with resistance rolls in particular, sometimes your armor bonus or your armor level, see this body armor in this little shield on the right hand side, sometimes your armor plays a part in resistance rolls. Will is things like morale checks. You need 3 ups on 2 dice to avoid trying to flee the table. So that's the last of your secondary stats. So that's there's will checks for different things, but think of things like morale and things like that. Okay, so on the right-hand side, there's some icons there that says an anchor. You see those 2 swords crossed with +0 and a scattergun with the multiple arrows, almost like a little chaos symbol there or something. You see multiple arrows with a +1. So really what this is kind of an easy, quick reference for you, so you don't have to flip to the back of the card. You can see the crossed swords here mean that's your default hand-to-hand attack, which is +0. So just like we said with the combat, you say, hey, you're combat 3, you're +1 or you're +1, or you're +2 or you're +3 for your weapon or whatever. This guy's hand-to-hand combat weapon is not particularly great. It's +0. So if this guy swings his anchor, I love that anchor there on the model. If this guy swings his anchor at a bad guy, he doesn't get to add anything for doing that. He's just a straight combat 3, no weapon modifiers. Now for his scattergun, the thing below it, again, this is a quick reference, which, you look on the back side of the card where it says weapons and attacks. It's going to give you the same information, but it's going to give you a little bit more information, like you need to reload it. It's unstable. That thing has special rules to it, but it's a short range projectile, which we'll get into, but it's +1. So when you're trying to shoot somebody, you use the combat score. When you're trying to hit somebody in hand-to-hand, you use the combat score. But you use the different weapon modifiers based on what weapon you're using, whether it's a ranged attack or a melee attack. And then the body armor, usually that's the body armor. That's the armor value on the body. A higher number there is better. And by the way, higher numbers on the melee weapons and the ranged weapons are better. Also, higher numbers on the body armor are better. So generally, those are kind of your weapons and your defensive stats right there along the right hand side. So underneath that is your special abilities. We already talked about Ruthless. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but there are special rules that apply to models, and they're captured here. So for every model that you pick, you kind of need to make sure that you understand what these rules are. They're all in the main rule book. They've got the Cliff Notes version on the bottom half of the front card, so you can see leader. Allies within one long stick get +1 on their activation. We already kind of talked about that, but you can look at these special abilities in this small middle box here, but they're also they've got the Cliff Notes version of what they mean, so you don't actually have to look and go diving into the rule book to find out. See what I did there? You don't have to go diving into the rule book to find out what these things mean. It actually tells you right there on the card. Now, sometimes there's a little bit of subtlety or some texture to these rules that you might need to get into in special circumstances, but in general, the general notion of what these rules mean is all captured on the card. So that's the front side of the card. Let's look at the back side of the card. Now that's the back half on the right hand side of your screen. So basically, again, it's the number of points, it's the guy's name. You see all these boxes and the names of the locations. So every model has wound boxes for different locations. Every model has a head, has a body, has weapons, maybe 1 or more weapons, usually 2, and then has locomotion or legs or some sort of propulsion. So like your head, your body, your legs, and then weapons. Those are the damage boxes for each one of your hit locations. Now, if you don't declare which location you're targeting, it always goes against the body, right? So you can do what's called precision shots or aimed shots or targeted shots against things like weapon systems or locomotion or the head. You can target, it's basically called targeting a subsystem, which is head, a weapon, which in lower part of the card is you can see under armor where it says light dive suit there, head. B is body, and then L is locomotion, and then weapons is 2. Each one of the weapons has an armor value of 2. So you can kind of see if you're targeting a subsystem, you can't really go by the body AV shield on the front card. You need to go back and look at the back of the card to see what's the actual armor value, on that location, which is interesting because this guy's got a heavily armored head. His body and his legs aren't very armored, but his weapons are super armored. So that's, again, interesting. A little bit of texture there that you wouldn't get by looking just at the front of the card. So the back of the card is really all about telling you about your hit locations, your body armor in specific locations, how much damage boxes you've got. It gives you a little bit more texture and detail on what the weapons are. So this is interesting in Deep Wars. Like the anchor. Let's take a look at that. It says complexity level 0. That we talked about that before. Complexity level 0 is like a club. Anyone with half a brain can use a club. So there's nothing specifically technical or hard that you have to really kind of study to understand in order to swing that anchor. You're going to connect. You're going to do some damage. Complexity level 1, you need to have a little bit deeper understanding, like a scattergun. You couldn't give a primitive creature a scattergun and have it use it effectively. You kind of have to know how that thing operates. So that's what the complexity level is. And so you can see on the special abilities on the front, Ether Tech 1, that means you can use complexity level 1 things. The interesting thing is on this thing is, on the front of the card where it says special abilities, it'll say shooter and then in parentheses a range. That means that the model can generally shoot at that range. One range stick or short range with no penalties is a short stick, which is one of the measurement sticks. You don't use a tape measure in this game. You use like each starter faction set or you can get these online too for free. They come with these measurement sticks of varying, like the short stick is a couple inches, I think. But the model is capable of shooting or targeting something effectively at short range. And the weapon itself is actually got a range on it too. So you kind of have to take the worst of both cases. Sometimes you might have a shooter medium, but the weapon is a short. You have to go with the short range. But sometimes you kind of have to pay attention to that. Like sometimes the weapon's range is not the same as the effective targeting range of the model. Usually they're the same, but sometimes they're not. But look at that scattergun. It's complexity level 1. It's a projectile short +1. That means that if you're shooting at a target within a short stick, you get +1 to your combat score when you're rolling to hit. And there's some other things there. We won't go into those details, but that's really what that means. It says +1. That is the combat modifier that you apply when you're using that weapon. Okay, and so the next underneath on the right-hand side, the back of the card is the armor. We talked about that a little bit. Sometimes there's special rules around the armor. You kind of have to give those a look, and that's all kind of categorized on this card. They also might have some special war gear items. We talked about that. Like this guy's got a respirator so he can breathe underwater, and there's some other things about that. This guy also has a crystal lamp so he can see in darkness, which is huge. Like if you are in the Abyssal zone and you don't have a light source, you can get what's called lost in the dark, and you kind of move randomly because you can't see anything. So that generally gives you a notion of what is on this card and what these things mean. Now that you've seen these cards, so like I said, this guy's 85 points. You pick other models to, let's say you're making a 400-point warband, you'd pick other models to put together to make a warband comprising up 400 points. And you kind of want to make sure that you've got maybe you want a leader, maybe you want a spellcaster. You want to create a warband where a leader might be buffing you for quality. You might want to create a warband where you've got someone who's casts a very specific spells that might help you in a specific scenario. But you want to kind of understand the nature of the models that you're putting together and their abilities so that they can kind of work together and synergize a little bit. But that should give you a general overall idea of what these things mean and how they play in the game. Now let's dive into some examples of gameplay just to kind of give you a flavor. I always feel like example is the best way to learn. So let's dive into some examples. I've picked 2 models. Let's pick the Tactical Dive Soldier from the Fortune Hunters and pit that model against an Abyssal Gark from the Scaly Horde. And let's just run through some scenarios of, okay, let's activate, let's move them, let's get them into combat, let's see what they do, and sort of show you some of the mechanics and how they play out on the table. Okay, so for our first example, let's assume that we've got just one model in each warband. I mean, that's a trivial example, but it'll just help illustrate the points, and we don't have to try to go through an entire warband, but you'll get the notion of what we're trying to do here. So this is Fortune Hunters versus the Scaly Horde, and we've got a Tactical Dive Soldier versus an Abyssal Gark. So let's assume for this first example that the Fortune Hunters won the die roll for attacker defender. So at the beginning of the game, you kind of roll to see who goes first. The person who rolls the highest must be the attacker, which means they set up first and they take the first turn. And the person who failed or lost that dice roll becomes the defender. So sometimes, depending on the scenario, the defender sends up the terrain and sets up the objectives and things like, it's based on the mission that you're playing. But for the sake of this argument, or for the sake of this example, for this first one, let's just assume that the Fortune Hunters are the attacker and the Scaly Horde is the defender. So the way that a gameplay turn goes is that the attacking side activates. So you choose each model in turn to either do a quick activation or roll to activate, and then you use your actions to move or attack or whatever. And then after all of the attackers have activated, or if you fail an activation, you go over to the defending side. And then the defending side picks a model, choose to either quick activate or roll to activate, use the activations to move and attack and so forth. And then, either you fail an activation or you activate all of your models. And then the turn goes over to the wild sea creature phase. And then in some scenarios, there is a event table. We won't talk about wild sea creatures or the event table in this. Those may be specific scenario driven, but sometimes there are wild sea creatures that have sort of this algorithm that they move towards the model with the lowest number of points. But for the sake of the argument of the normal game turn, that's how it goes. But for the sake of this example, we're just going to simply activate the Fortune Hunters, and then we'll activate the Abyssal Gark just to kind of show you how it works. So the Fortune Hunters won the attacker defender role, so they're going first. So let's say that this model chooses to do a quick activation. That model could move one medium stick or perform one action, and then they turn over to the next model in line on their side. Since there's no other models in this example, it would just go over to the Abyssal Gark. But that's pretty simple. You get that one free action or that quick activation, but that's not really the interesting part of how these activations work. So we're going to see what happens when you try to roll to activate. So instead of just taking your quick action, you can roll 2 or 3 dice to do multiple activations. So in this example, let's assume we just pick up 3 dice. Hey, we're going for broke. We're going to try to get as many actions as we can. So looking at the Fortune Hunter's card, you can see that Fortune Hunter's Tactical Dive Soldier is a quality 4 model. That means when I pick up 3 dice and I try to do multiple actions, I have to roll 4 or higher on those dice in order to get actions. Now remember, if I roll a 1 or 2 or a 3, that's a failed activation roll, which is potentially dangerous. So if I get 3 successes of 4 or 5, which means I get at least 4, 5, or 6 on all 3 dice, that means I get 3 actions. So I could do 2 moves and an attack, I could do a move and attack, or I could do a move and a mighty blow, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But that will give you 3 actions. If I roll 2 successes, like a 5 and a 6, and then a 1, that means I get 2 actions, and then I nominate the next model in line to activate. If I get 2 failures, let's say I roll a 1, a 3, and a 5, I get my 1 action, and then I have to turn over the turn. I got more failures than successes, so I still get to keep my action, which I can take my 1 action, but then I have to turn over the turn to the Scaly Horde. Even if I've got models on my warband that have not activated yet, the turn goes over to the defending player. So if I roll 3 dice and I get a 1, a 2, and a 3, or a 1, and a 1, I got no 4-ups based on my quality stat for this model. I got no 4-ups. That means that model takes no actions, and I turn the turn immediately over to the Scaly Horde. So basically, when you're rolling multiple activations, you're gambling a little bit and trying to get more actions per your for your model than just the one standard activation. And sometimes this can really help you a lot, but it's also weighed against the, hey, I might actually not get to activate any of my other models downstream. So sometimes a strategy that I employ or other players might employ, I'm sure they do, is like you start maybe a little bit conservative at the beginning, or you start with models with really low quality scores that are almost guaranteed to succeed. And maybe you take your riskier activations like your 3-ups or your 4-ups later on in the turn when you maybe don't have as many models that might not activate that turn. Sometimes that goes horribly awry, like on a quality 2 model, maybe you roll 3 1s, and that's like horrible. But that's the risk you take. So there's a little bit of probability and dice math that you need to kind of think through when you try to activate these models. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff. So we understand how to activate our models. It's pretty straightforward once you kind of get the notion of what the activation, the quality stat means. Now remember, if you put a leader within a long stick of your models, you get a bonus to your quality. So in those tactical dive soldiers or those abyssal garks, if you put that iron belly clegg within a long stick of your quality 4 model, the tactical dive soldier, he now activates on 3s. So the dice odds are a lot better activating on 3s than they are on 4s. So kind of explore that a little bit. Putting leaders near your warband is really, really crucial to getting the most out of your activations. So now let's move on to combat. So there's 2 big stats in Deep Wars and Shadowsea. One is quality, the other is combat. So let's talk a little bit about that. So let's say again that the Fortune Hunters are the attacker and it's their turn, and they activate their tactical dive soldier, and let's say they, it's just a quality 4 model, and he rolls a 4, a 5, and a 2. So that means he's got 2 actions. That means that Abyssal Gark model is, let's say, 2 medium sticks away. And a tactical dive soldier, if it doesn't say how far a model moves on the card, you assume by default that they move a medium stick. So only a few models move a short stick and only a few models move a long stick, unless you're Nereids, when just about everything moves a long stick. If it doesn't say anything, you assume that you move a medium stick. So each action is 1 movement of up to the length of a medium stick. Now, you cannot move through your own models. You cannot bend that movement stick. You have to go in a straight line. You can change your facing, but you have to go in a straight line. Unless you're maneuverable, like the Direfish Lizard, you can kind of swim around things. But generally, you have to move in a straight line. You cannot move over the other models. So in this example, if the Abyssal Gark is 2 medium sticks away, that tactical dive soldier can move 2 medium sticks and get in base-to-base contact with that Abyssal Gark. Now, sadly, he does not have another action to attack. So you can get into contact with that Abyssal Gark, but you couldn't actually try to attack him. So now let's say you roll a 4, a 2, and a 1. Well, that's a failed activation. You can still move your guy, or if he wanted to shoot his weapon, he could try to shoot his weapon, or you can do an evasive action maneuver, but you get that 1 action. But let's say that tactical dive soldier rolls a 4, a 5, and a 6. That's 3 actions. You can do 2 movements, and you can do an attack. And so let's break down how attacks and combat in hand-to-hand works. So in this example, we got 3 actions. So we are going to spend the first 2 actions to move the tactical dive soldier 2 medium sticks to get into base-to-base contact with the Abyssal Gark, like this. You simply place the medium stick down, you move the length of the stick, you place it down again for your second action, and move the length of the stick, and that gets you into base-to-base contact. So when you initiate a attack action, you place modifiers onto your base combat score for each model, and you do a single opposed dice roll to see what the outcome is. So in this particular case, the tactical dive soldier is combat 4. His hand-to-hand weapon is a dive knife. It's not, you don't use your ranged weapon. If it's got a projectile, you can't use that in hand-to-hand. You have to use something that's got the HTH modifier or label on it. So your dive knife is complexity level 0, and it doesn't have any modifiers, so it's +0. So there are other modifiers that we apply to this as well. So you're not doing anything like a rear attack or flanked by an enemy, or attacking a transfixed or a fallen foe. I'm showing this table here because these are the basic hand-to-hand combat modifiers that you might apply based on the type of situation you're in. So you've got your base combat, you've got your weapon modifier, and any of these hand-to-hand ability modifiers or hand-to-hand tactical modifiers that might apply. So in this particular case, we did a rush, which is at the bottom of this table. So if you do one move plus the attack action, that's called a charge. If you do two moves plus an attack action, that's called a rush, which means you get +2 to the attacker's dice roll. Combat 4, your weapon is +0, and you did a rush, which gives you +2. So your total combat modifier is dice +6 for the tactical dive soldier. Now let's talk about the Abyssal Gark. The Abyssal Gark is combat 4. His weapon, he has a choice. He has a crystal trident, which is hand-to-hand +1. He also has clawed hands, which are hand-to-hand +0. So why two weapons? Why two hand-to-hand weapons when clearly the crystal trident is better? Well, sometimes you remember those damage boxes on your weapons? Sometimes you target subsystems, and maybe the trident has been destroyed, or maybe based on that fragile special rule on the trident, maybe he's lost his trident. Anyways, you've got multiple options. Sometimes you've got ability to do additional attacks. Usually you can only do one attack action per round for a model unless you've got something called a combo attack. So most models are only going to be able to do one attack action. You can do multiple move actions, but you can only do one attack action unless you've got something like combo hit. But that's a little bit more advanced, so we won't cover that right now. But in general, looking at this Abyssal Gark Warrior, again, you start with your combat score, combat 4. Your weapon is plus. Let's use that crystal trident because that tactical dive soldier, he's charging in hard. We need every bonus we can get. Let's use that crystal trident, so that gives me +1. And if I look at my table of modifiers, am I bigger? Is any model agile? Is anyone attacking from the rear, flanked, or surrounded? Anybody doing a mighty attack? We'll get into that in a bit. No elevated position, no ambush, and the Gark certainly didn't charge. So there's no hand-to-hand ability modifiers on this chart that apply to the Gark. So he is simply combat 4 plus weapon is +1, so that his total combat score is dice +5. Okay, now that we've gone through the simple exercise of just figuring out what your modifiers are, now you roll a dice and you add your combat modifier to that dice roll. So then you consult a chart that tells you what happens. So let's for a moment pretend that the Fortune Hunters player rolls a 4 and the Scaly Horde player rolls a 2. So that would mean dice +6 would be 10 for the tactical dive soldier, and dice +5 would be a 7 for the Scaly Horde Abyssal Gark player. So 10 versus 7, you consult this chart, and it's a pretty simple chart, so you can pretty much memorize what this is, but sometimes I do have to go back and look at it. But essentially, you look at the difference between the two numbers, and that difference is called the winning combat difference. And based on that winning combat difference, that tells you how that round of combat resolved. So in a 10 versus 7, the winning combat difference is greater than the opponent's armor value. So the difference is 3, right? So you take a look at the Abyssal Gark's armor value, which is 1. The winning combat difference for the Fortune Hunter player was 3. So the winning combat difference is greater than the opponent's armor value. So that means that the Abyssal Gark would take 1 wound to the body and is fallen. Fallen means you have to spend an action to get back up next turn. So that's pretty straightforward, right? So let's say the dice rolls were different. Let's say the dice roll for the tactical dive soldier was a 2, and let's say the dice roll for the Abyssal Gark player was a 6. So for the Fortune Hunters player, a dice roll of 2 plus 6 is an 8, And the dice roll for the Abyssal Gark is a 6, so a 6 plus a 5 is an 11. So an 11 versus an 8 is a winning combat difference of 3 for the Abyssal Gark. So this is actually pretty interesting. With this opposed die roll, it's not just necessarily the attacker that can do wounds. The defender can actually do wounds to the attacking player. So again, we go back to the winning combat difference is 3. We take a look at the armor value of the tactical dive soldier, which is 2. So consulting this chart, the winning combat difference is greater than or equal to the opponent's AV. So in that particular case, the tactical dive soldier would take 1 wound and is fallen. So this is a pretty interesting chart because you can have all sorts of permutations or combinatorics based on what your combat modifier was and what your dice roll was. So you kind of go down this chart. So if you roll a tie, like you roll dice and the dice plus whatever your modifiers were a tie, and your defender has some armor, that means there's absolutely no effect. So you're flailing about and nobody takes any damage. So, but if your combat's tie and the defender's armor is 0, which can happen, that means the defender takes a wound and is fallen. And so when one combatant wins, so when the total dice of one player is greater than the other, then you go through the, hey, did the winning combat difference not exceed the armor? So that means your hit connected, but it didn't blow through the armor. So recoil plus advantage means you just move the hit party. So like if the attacker hits the defender but doesn't break armor, you just move the defender 1 base length back, and you have a status called advantage, which gives you additional bonuses for combat against that model in the future. But if your winning combat difference is greater than the armor, that next line there, you get the wound and fallen. There's this concept of doubling and tripling, which is interesting. So let's say your model was combat 5 and you rolled a 5, and the defender's combat was 2 and you rolled a 3. So that means the attacker had a total score of 10 and the defender had a total score of 5. That means that the attacker's score is double the opponent's score. So that means you do 2 wounds and are fallen, assuming you break the armor, of course, but that's pretty strong blow, so you probably get right through the armor. It can also happen such that there are modifiers where you might actually triple your opponent's combat score, where, like, say you roll a 12, they roll a 4 total. You can do actually 3 wounds and it's fallen. And sometimes if you do enough wounds, if you do enough wound boxes to the body, the model is dead. That is the state of death in Deep Wars or Shadowsea. If you blow out all the wound boxes in the body, that model counts as dead. If you do more wounds than the body currently has in open wound boxes, that's what's called a gruesome death, or destroyed, which means it cannot be healed, and it usually causes some kind of panic or morale check within your warband, because like, oh god, the shark bit the dude's head clean off, and so that's like completely horrible and disgusting, and kind of makes you a little weak in the knees. You don't want to fight anymore. It's like, hey Frank and Joe and Bob, let's get the heck out of here. So there's this concept of, okay, well, there are wounds that are so gruesome or so egregious that's like everyone around it notices and like, hey, it's time. You kind of, check your gumption and see whether or not you want to run for the door. So that combat results is really kind of the algorithm, if you will, sort of figuring out how to do a round of combat in Deep Wars or Shadowsea. It's pretty straightforward. You've got to kind of pay attention to the modifiers. You roll the dice, you add it up, you compare the values. The winning combat difference, which is the delta between the 2 scores, tells you exactly what you need to do to resolve that combat. Let's talk briefly about some of the other modifiers that you will encounter and why the distinction between them is important. So in our last example, we did what was called a rush, where we did 2 moves and then an attack. There's also a charge where, hey, if you get 1 move and then you attack, you get a +1. A rush is 2 moves and then plus an attack. It will give you +2. There's this thing called a mighty blow and in the ranged combat, which is very similar to what we just did. So I'm only going to go over that briefly, but let's go over some of the difference between these two types of modifiers. There's a thing called in hand-to-hand combat called a mighty blow, which is different from a charge. And it's really important because when we first started playing this, we kind of goofed this up, and the distinction is very important, and it's actually pretty powerful. So there's a difference between charging and rushing and mighty blow. So what is the difference, or a mighty attack? The charge and rush gives +1 to the attacking model. Okay. Mighty attack with 2 or 3 actions gives a minus to the defender's combat score. Now, you would think, okay, well, plus to the attackers or minus to the defenders, same difference, right? Well, not really. And the distinction is that you can't really apply a mighty blow attack of 2 or 3 actions to the attacker's combat score and get the same result. And here's why. If you add numbers to your attacking combat score, that certainly gives you a better chance of winning the combat. Absolutely. But let's say you do a charge and a mighty blow. You're putting +1 on your combat score, the dice plus some number to yours, but you're minusing your opponent's combat score. And the reason why this is important is that if you do a mighty blow, you actually increase your chances of doubling or tripling your opponent. Think about it. Is if you reduce your opponent's total dice modifier, it makes a really big difference. Like if you have a final result of 10 versus 6 versus 10 versus 5, like if you spent one of your actions to rush, or if you spent one of your actions to do a mighty blow, that's a big difference. The difference of 1 pip on the dice can actually do 2 wounds to the body as opposed to 1. And if you've got the special rule Savage, doubling does 3 wounds to the body. So it's really an important distinction to kind of call out here, because there's a little bit of tactical kind of thinking through. Is like, does it make more sense to try to do a mighty blow, or does it make more sense to try to do the rush? Like sometimes you've got to close the distance. Like if you can't connect with the attack, or if you can't connect the attacker with the defender, no amount of doing a mighty attack is going to help you. But if you're there and you've got an extra action to spend, you might want to spend one of those actions to do a mighty attack, because you're just going to increase your chances of doing more damage. And so, important distinction there. All right, let's try to cover one more topic, and then maybe this video is getting a little bit long, so maybe we can cover one more topic and then we can land this pig, and that is ranged combat. So ranged combat is a lot like hand-to-hand combat, so I'm only going to cover that briefly here. So really, ranged combat is really any of those projectile weapons like we talked about a little bit ago, but the process is a little bit different in 2 key ways. One, when you're doing ranged combat, you don't add weapon modifiers for the defender, right? It is the attacker's combat score plus any weapon modifiers plus any other ranged ability modifiers or ranged tactical modifiers based on this table here. The defender does not add any weapon skill or weapon abilities to their ranged combat, so that actually gives a little bit of an edge to ranged combat in the sense of the defenders don't get to necessarily have higher combat scores like they normally would or potentially would in hand-to-hand combat. The other difference is that in hand-to-hand combat there is a possibility of the defender actually doing what's called a counter blow or a counter strike, where you might roll the dice, and it turns out, just like in that second example with the Gark and the tactical dive soldier, that the Gark actually hit the tactical dive soldier. There's nothing like that. You either hit or you miss, and the attacker doesn't have any potential blowback from their actions of taking a range shot. Now, the other part of this is that ranged combat is obviously ranged, and so the range of the weapon and the range of the person shooting the weapon both have to jive a little bit, and we talked about that a little bit earlier before, so I won't really go into too much greater detail there, but do pay attention to the range of the weapon and the range of the shooter so that you kind of make sure that you're shooting at the right range. So the way that this works is just like in hand-to-hand combat. You've got your combat score, you add the bonus for the weapon, then you add any ranged ability modifiers or any ranged tactical modifiers. Like if you're shooting at a target that is big or huge, you get +1. It's easier to hit a big target, right? If the target is agile, it's -1 to the shooter. If the target is using used an evasive action or has an energy shield, that's -2 to the shooter or the attacker's combat score. So other ranged modifiers is the target's in tactical cover, like if it's halfway or partially obscured, it's -1 to the shooter. So the other interesting part about shooting is range and aiming. So when you shoot a weapon, like if you're a medium shooter, the range of your weapon is 1 medium stick with no penalties. If you go to 2 medium sticks, it's -2 to the shooter. And if you go to 3 medium sticks in range, it's -4 to the shooter. So things like fall in, there's no bonus to the shooter. If the target is transfixed, that's a state. Like if you get magically affected, sometimes you get transfixed. It's easier to shoot somebody who's standing there not trying to evade you, so you get a little bit of a bonus there. The other interesting part, kind of going back to the range stuff, is aimed shot. So the defender, if you're aiming, the defender gets -1 combat score if you apply 2 actions, like an aim and the shot. It's -2 combat score with 2 actions and the shot. So extended shots are 3x and 4x for the penalty of -2 and -4. Well, what the heck does that mean? So aiming not only gives a negative modifier to the defender, it also extends your range. So right above this, where it said extends range 2x, 3x, and -2 to -4 to the shooter, a couple rows above, if you apply 1 action to aim, you don't start incurring that -2, -4 bonus until the 3rd or the 4th range band. So that would say if you applied 1 aim action, that means you get 2 medium sticks of range with no negative modifier. So that's basically how that works. So again, you add your combat score to your weapon modifier and any other modifiers that apply. You each roll your opposed dice, and the outcome depends just the same as that combat resolution chart that we showed you before. Depending on what the result is what the result is for the defending model. Again, there's no such thing as a counterattack in a shooting sort of situation, and so really, and that's a little bit made up for. Some of the penalties, the ranges aren't particularly egregiously long, and so it's a little bit, unless you're a little bit more danger close, you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of effective shooting. But you can get some modifiers on there that can actually really put the hurt on the shooting. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. So it really is that simple, and basically the same as hand-to-hand combat, but particularly with the aiming and whatnot, sort of analogous to the Mighty Blow type of thing. But you add the range thing in there, and so you kind of have to pay attention to that. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward, and that's how you conduct shooting. So this video has really been about covering the really, really basics of the mechanics of how to play the game of Deep Wars and Shadowsea. I didn't go into tremendous amounts of detail. Really, the goal here was, so if you are brand new to the Abyssal Realms and you have no idea how this game plays, and you've never played the Song of Blades and Heroes types games, Hopefully by watching this, you've got some idea of what the heck we're talking about when we do some of our battle reports. So my goal and my hope is that if you watch this video and you go play Deep Wars or Shadow Sea, that you'll have a little bit deeper understanding. You're still probably going to need to get a practice game in or two before you really get the hang of it. But the combat and the movement and the activation mechanics are very simple and straightforward. And once you kind of play the game and get to see how the flow goes, it's actually very straightforward, and I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. So now, after watching these videos, and after you've watched this video, hopefully the battle reports that you watch and the Tactica videos that I'm going to be putting out will make a lot more sense, and you'll be able to follow along. It'll be a much more enriching experience to watch those things and kind of follow along. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please give me a comment or feedback. I'm always open to the feedback. And if you've liked something about this, or you felt like you wanted something more in depth in a future episode, do let me know. And I thank you for your time for watching, and happy wargaming.